Good morning, Vineyard Church Glendora. It's a pleasure to be back with you today and talking about Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. My name is John Ragsdale. I know many of you, but many of you I have yet to meet, and I want to thank my dear bride, Sue, for reading the text for us. Sue and I, a little background, Sue and I came to Vineyard Church Glendora about 3.5 years ago, shortly after we moved to Southern California for me to take a job up at APU. And it's been our pleasure to spend the last 3.5 years with you, and certainly sitting under the teaching and leadership of Abigail and Jacob. Thank you very much, Abigail and Jacob, for what you have meant to us, and thank you, Vineyard Church Glendora, for your deposit in our lives. So let's get to Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. I love this passage. And I love this passage because I've become convinced that this is the linchpin for understanding the Sermon on the Mount, and in some ways then all of the Gospel of Matthew. And so you might say, well, that seems like a pretty big claim. It is, and hopefully in the next few minutes I'll demonstrate why I think that. But whether you buy into that premise or not, it will not eliminate the fact that Jesus is telling us good news here in Matthew 5, 17 through 20. And we need to pay attention. When Jesus speaks, we kind of need to pay attention and listen to the good news that he's telling us. So let's think about the Sermon on the Mount for a minute, a little bit of review. Some people have said that the Sermon on the Mount is the ethical statement of Jesus. And I suppose that's true as far as it goes, but I wouldn't want to let that kind of idea limit the way we think about the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is about the kingdom. In Matthew chapter 4, Jesus comes announcing the kingdom of God, right? In Matthew chapter 5, we begin this 3-chapter treatise on how one lives in the kingdom, what life in the kingdom looks like. Is it ethical? Sure, but it's also eschatological. It's also the inbreak of the kingdom of God into the affairs of humankind. And we need to pay attention to that. And as we do that, and as we begin to unpack this passage and unpack the Sermon on the Mount, we get an idea of how Jesus is approaching what it means to have life in the kingdom. Now, in terms of Matthew's overall agenda and premise, many, and I'm one of them, is convinced that one of the things that Matthew is trying to do is to establish the validity of the church as over against the synagogue. Rome only had so much room for authorized religions. And so one of the things that Matthew is doing is, I think, painting a picture of the legitimacy of the church. And in some ways, in the process, demonstrating how it goes beyond what the received and authorized religion as codified and experienced by the scribes and Pharisees. So we've got a little bit of a struggle going on there as well, and that's one of the things that we pick up when we read through the Gospel of Matthew. So a little bit of where we've been in particular. We've had 2 sermons so far, 3 including the introduction, 2 sermons so far having to do with the text of the Sermon on the Mount. We talked about the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who are broken and abused in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who are gripped by grief and mourning, for they're going to be comforted. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, because they're going to be filled. And the other 5, right? There are these statements that are not about how you get things from God, but the way God pronounces and announces blessing upon those who have hit rock bottom. There's this idea in the Hebrew prophets that God was on the side of the righteous poor. Jesus is carrying through with that idea. The poor are in some ways blessed and loved and appreciated by God. Thus, we need to think about how we address poverty in our world, because Jesus cares about the poor. So there's that. Last week we talked about Matthew 5:13 through 16, salt and light. These two ideas, these two metaphors are not, again, something we strive for. They are something we are. When we come to Christ, we become salt and light. And there is this idea for Jesus' first hearers that they've just been blown away by being told that they're blessed. And now that blessing has a reason. It has this impact for others. And notice the way chapter 5, verse 16 culminates. It says, let your light shine so that others will see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. So that's why you're salt. That's why you're light, right? So that others will experience the blessing that comes with being the people of Abraham. Going back to Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3. And then we have our text for today, Matthew 5:17 through 20. And it would be easy to just kind of go, in fact, I debated this when I was preparing. It would be easy to just kind of go verse by verse, but I want to start at verse 20. I want to start at verse 20 because that is the verse, along with some study I was doing in Matthew chapter 7 about the two ways, the two gates, that I think I'm in the queue for that one too. Several years ago, it was these two passages that gripped my mind, gripped my thinking about what does this mean? Because if I'm a first century hearer, and I hear this guy, this rabbi up on the mountaintop, and he says, hey, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you don't get to enter the kingdom of heaven. He's just told me, as someone who's poor and broken in spirit, that the kingdom of heaven belongs to me, and yet now he's setting this standard. And I'm looking around and I'm going, scribes and Pharisees, these are the guys that have it figured out. They know what it means to be righteous. I don't know what it means to be righteous because I'm just trying to pay my bills. But the scribes and Pharisees, they have given a lot of attention to this. In fact, those Pharisees, they know that when you tithe, you got to tithe on the spices down to the very grains, right? You tithe on mint, dill, and cumin. And that's how specific you are in your tithing. And Jesus says, unless your righteousness goes beyond that, you don't get to enter the kingdom of heaven. And that started me on my journey. Because I got to tell you, my friends, if it has to do with being so detailed and specific in terms of righteousness, if Jesus has come announcing that we need to be more detailed than the scribes and Pharisees, I just don't have it in me. But I don't think that's what he's saying. So if that's not what he's saying, then the question, the other question that obtains, right, is what is he saying? He said in chapter 5, verse 17, I came to fulfill the law and the prophets. He says in 18 that heaven and earth are going to pass away before just one little letter or one little dash or stroke of the law passes away. That's how important it is. He says in verse 19 that whoever annuls one of these commandments and teaches others to do the same, they're going to be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. The one that's called great is the one that keeps them and does them and teaches others to do the same. And by implication, he's indicting. He's throwing down with the scribes and Pharisees, because what he's saying to them is, you ain't doing it. So if they're not doing it, then what's Jesus, what opportunity is he opening up for you and for me? Think about that for a moment. We'll come back in a second.